Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Joseph, Andrea, Sarah, and Jess. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us cover the costs of recording, production, and distribution while keeping this podcast 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're relaxing with the second half of a classic that more than 2,000 years ago defined many of the dramatic tropes we still use today. The Characters of Theophrastus, a translation with introduction by Charles E. Bennett and William A. Hammond, professors in Cornell University. Published in 1902 by Longmans Green & Co. of New York, London, and Bombay. Let's pick up right where we left off. Character 7, the Newsmonger. Newsmaking is the concoction of false stories of what people say and do at the gossip's caprice. The newsmonger is one who straightway strikes an attitude and assumes a smiling air when he meets a friend, and asks, "Where have you been? What news? How is the situation? Have you any fresh words about it?" And then, going straight on, he asks, "Is there no later report? Well, the current rumors are good." And without letting his friend reply, he keeps right on. "What? You haven't heard a word about it? Then I think I have a feast of news for you." He always has in readiness some unheard-of soldier, or a slave belonging to one Asteus, a piper, or Lycan, an obscure contractor, just back from the battlefield, and it is from one of these that he has heard the tidings. The authorities for his reports are of the sort that you can never get hold of. Such are the men he quotes when he tells how Polyperchon and the king carried the day, and Cassander was taken prisoner. If anybody asks, "Do you believe this?" he replies, "Why, the story is noised all about the city, is constantly gaining ground, and the whole population is of one mind. Everybody is agreed about the battle. It must have been a regular death's feast." He reads a proof of it, too, in the faces of men in authority, for they all wear a changed look. He says he overheard that a man had come from Macedonia who knows the whole history of the battle, and that he has been concealed now 5 days in a house with the authorities. There is a convincing pathos in his voice. You can imagine it, as he tells his story and exclaims, luckless Cassander, ill-starred hero, lo, the fickleness of fortune. Vain it was that he rose to power, but what I say is strictly between ourselves. Then he trips off and repeats the story to every man in town. 8. The Mean Man. Meanness is undue sparing of expense. The mean man is the sort of person who will go to a creditor's house and demand a halfpenny interest before the month is up. At dinner he counts the glasses each guest drinks, and amongst his fellow banqueters he pours the smallest offering to Artemis. He counts up the price a friend pays for a cheap purchase, exclaiming that it takes his last penny. If a servant breaks a pot or plate, he deducts its value from his rations. If his wife has lost a 3-farthing piece, he turns the furniture, beds, and cupboards round and hunts between the boards of the floor. When he has anything to sell, he puts the price so high that the buyer gets no bargain. He permits no one to take a fig from his garden or to cross his field, or even pick up an olive or a date that has fallen to the ground. He examines his boundary marks every day to see that they have not been touched. And he is always ready in case of default to use the right of seizure and to collect compound interest. When he gives a banquet to his townsmen, he cuts the meat in small pieces and sets a portion before each guest. He goes to market but buys nothing. He forbids his wife to lend salt or a lampwick, or a pinch of cumin, marjoram or meal, a fillet or a sacrificial wafer, observing that these trifles make a large sum in the course of a year. In a word, one may see that the mean man's money chest is mouldy from being unopened, the key rusty, his cloak too scant to reach his thigh, that he uses a mean little oil jar, has his hair cropped to the scalp. He does not wear his boots until midday, and charges the fuller to use plenty of earth on his coat to keep it from soon getting soiled again. 9. The Stupid Man. Stupidity one may define as sluggishness in what a man says or does. The stupid man computes a sum, sets down the total, and then asks his neighbor, "How much does it all make?" When he is defendant in a suit and should go to court, he forgets all about it and puts off to his farm. When he goes to a play at the theater, he is the only spectator that is left behind on the benches asleep. He gets up in the night to go out after he has gorged himself and is bitten by the neighbor's dog. He takes a thing and puts it away, but when he comes to look for it, he cannot find it. If the death of a friend is announced to him, that he may go to the funeral, with a sorrowful air and tears in his eyes, he says, "Thank God." When he goes to receive payment of a debt, he takes witnesses with him. In the winter season, he quarrels with his slave because cucumbers have not been provided. He forces his children to wrestle and to run until they fall into a fever. When he is roughing it in the country and himself cooks the vegetables, he puts salt in the pot twice and so makes the dish impossible. When it rains and others declare that the sky is darker than pitch, he exclaims, "How sweet it is to consider the stars." And if he is asked, "What is the mortality of the city?" how many bodies have passed through the sacred gates, he replies, "Would that you and I had as many." 10. The surly man. Surliness is sullen rudeness of speech. The surly man is one who, when you ask him, "Who is that gentleman?" retorts, "Don't bother me." And when you greet him on the street, refuses to return your salutation. When he has anything for sale, he will not tell the purchaser what he charges, but instead inquires, "How much do I get for it?" When one would show him some attention and sends him a gift for the holidays, he says he is not in need of presents. He accepts no excuse when by accident you smudge his clothes, or push against him in a crowd, or chance to tread upon his foot. If you ask for his contribution to some object, he refuses to make one, though afterwards he may bring it around, declaring, however, that he's throwing the money away. Sometimes he stumbles in the street, and then he curses the stone that tripped him up. And he's not a man to tarry many minutes for a friend who has an appointment with him. Singing, declamation, and dancing are amusements for which he has no taste, and it's exactly like him to refuse to join even in prayer to the gods. 11. The superstitious man. Superstition is a crouching fear of unseen powers. The superstitious man is the sort of person who begins the day only after he has sprinkled himself, washed his hands with holy water, and taken a sprig of laurel in his mouth. If a weasel cross his path, he will not go a step further until someone else has crossed, or until he has thrown 3 stones over the way. If he sees a snake in his house, he prays to Sabazius, provided it is a copperhead, or if it be a sacred serpent, he straightway builds a shrine upon the spot. As he passes by the consecrated stones at the crossroads, he pours oil on them from his flask, falls on his knees and prays before he goes further. If a mouse should gnaw through a leather flour bag, he goes to the seer and asks what he shall do. If the seer bids him give the bag to the cobbler to be sewn up, he pays no heed to him, but goes his way and offers up the bag as a holy sacrifice. He is given to purifying his house often by religious rites, and insists it is haunted by Hecate. When he takes a walk and hears an owl hoot, he is terrified and cries out, "Athena, thine is the power," and so walks on. He will not step on a grave, nor go up to a corpse, nor to a woman in confinement, but says it is not well to risk pollution. He orders his domestics to mull the wine on the 4th and 7th of the month, while he goes out and buys myrtle, incense, and holy cakes. On his return, he spends the livelong day in crowning the images of Hermaphroditus. He goes to the Orphic mysteries to be initiated into them. You will be sure to find him amongst the people who frequent the beach to besprinkle themselves. Every month he goes there with his wife, or if his wife is busy, then with the nurse and children. If he observes anyone at the crossroads crowned with garlic, on his return he washes himself from head to foot, summons a priestess, and gives orders to celebrate rites of purification either with an onion or a small dog. Whenever he sees a madman or an epileptic, he shakes with terror and spits in his bosom. 12. The thankless man. Thanklessness is an improper criticism of what one receives. The thankless man, when a friend has sent him something from his table, says to the servant who brings it, "He grudged me a dish of soup and a cup of wine, I suppose, and so wouldn't invite me to dinner." When his sweetheart kisses him, he says, "I wonder if you really do love me so in your heart." He blames Zeus, not for raining, but for not raining before. When he picks up a purse in the street, he says, "But I never found a treasure." If he secures a slave at a bargain after long dickering with the owner, he says, "I imagine I haven't got much at this price." To the person who brings the glad tidings that a son is born to him, he retorts, "If you only add, and half your fortune's gone, you'll hit it." When he wins his case in court and secures a unanimous verdict, he abuses his attorney for having omitted many points in his brief. When his friends make him up a purse and wish him joy, "Why so?" he exclaims. "Is it because I shall have to pay you all back, and be grateful into the bargain, as though you had done me a favor?" 13. The suspicious man. Suspicion is a kind of belief that everybody is fraudulent. The suspicious man is the sort of person who sends a servant to market and then sends another to watch him and find out the price he pays. When he carries the money himself, he sits down every 100 yards and counts it over. After he is in bed, he asks his wife whether she locked the chest and shut the cupboard, and whether the hall door bolt was pushed well in. If she answers yes, he gets up nevertheless and lights a lamp. Naked and barefoot he goes around and examines everything. Even then he finds it hard to go to sleep. When he goes to collect interest, he takes witnesses along, lest his debtors deny the claims. He has his cloak dyed, not by the best workman, but by the fuller who can furnish good security. If anyone asks the loan of a wine set, he prefers not to lend it. But if a member of his family or a near relative wants it, he makes the loan. Yet he scarcely does so until he has had it assayed and weighed, and has received a guarantee for its safe return. He orders his footmen not to fall behind him, but to go in front, so that by watching him he may prevent his running away. If a purchaser has bought goods of him and says, "Charge the amount to me, I have no time now to send the money," he replies, "Do not trouble yourself about it. When you have finished your business, I will go with you and get my pay." 14. The disagreeable man. Disagreeableness we may define as a kind of conduct which is annoying, although it may not be injurious. The disagreeable man will go to a friend and wake him out of a sound sleep to have a talk with him. He detains passengers who are on the point of embarking. Others who have come to see him he bids wait until he has taken his walk. He takes the baby from its nurse, chews its food for it and feeds it, dandles it on his knee while he coos to it and calls it Papa's little rascal. At table he tells the company how he once took hellebore and was physicked through and through, and how his bile was blacker than the soup on the table. He says he has cool cistern water at his house and a garden full of tender vegetables, that his cook is a perfect chef, and that his house is a regular hotel, for it is always full of company, and his guests are like leaky sieves. Do the best he can, it is impossible to fill them. When he gives a dinner, he exhibits his jester and shows him off before the company. To enliven his guests over their cups, he says that further pleasures have been arranged for them. 15. The exquisite. Exquisiteness is a striving for honor in small things. The exquisite, when invited to dinner, is eager to sit by his host. When he cuts off his son's hair for an offering to the gods, no place but Delphi will answer for the ceremony. His attendant must be an Ethiopian. When he pays a mina of money, he makes a point of offering a freshly minted piece. If he has a pet daw in the house, he must needs buy it a ladder and a brazen shield, that the daw may learn to climb the ladder carrying the shield. When he has sacrificed an ox, he winds the head and horns with fillets and nails them up opposite the entrance, in order that those who come in may see what he has been doing. When he parades with the cavalry, he gives all his accoutrements to his squire to carry home, and throwing back his mantle, stalks proudly about the marketplace in his spurs. When his pet dog dies, he raises a monument to the creature, and has a pillar erected with the inscription, Fido, pure Maltese. In the Asclepion, he dedicates a brazen finger, polishes it, crowns it with flowers, and anoints it every day with oil. And he has his hair cut frequently. His teeth are always pearly white. While his old suit is still good, he gets himself a new one, and he anoints himself with the choicest perfumes. In the agora, he frequents the bankers' counters. If he visits the gymnasia, he selects those in which the Ephebi practice. And when there's a play, the place he chooses in the theater is close beside the general's. He makes few purchases for himself, but sends presents to his friends at Byzantium, and Spartan dogs to Cyzicus, and Hemetian honey to Rhodes. And when he does these things, he tells it about the town. Naturally, his tastes run to pet monkeys, parrots, Sicilian doves, gazelles' knuckle bones, Thurian jars, crooked canes from Sparta, hangings enwrought with Persian figures, a wrestling ring sprinkled with sand, and a tennis court. He goes around and offers this arena to philosophers, sophists, fighters, and musicians for their exhibitions, and at the performances he himself comes in last of all, that the spectators may say to one another, "That's the gentleman to whom the place belongs." And of course, when he is a Praetonus, he demands of his colleagues the privilege of announcing to the people the result of the sacrifice. Then, putting on a fine garment and a garland of flowers, he advances and says, "O men of Athens, we Prytanes have made sacrifice to the mother of the gods. The sacrifice is fair and good. Receive ye each your portion." When he has made this announcement, he returns home and tells his wife all about it in an ecstasy of joy. 16. The garrulous man. Garrulity is incessant heatless talk. Your garrulous man is one, for instance, who sits down beside a stranger, and after recounting the virtues of his wife, tells the dream he had last night and everything he ate for supper. Then, if his efforts seem to meet with favor, he goes on to declare that the present age is sadly degenerate, says wheat is selling very low, that hosts of strangers are in town, and that since the Dionysia, the weather is good again for shipping, and that if Zeus would only send more rain, the crops would be much heavier, and that he's proposing to have a farm himself next year, and that life's a constant struggle, and that at the Mysteries Demipus set up an enormous torch, and tells how many columns the Odeon has. And yesterday, says he, I had an awful turn with my stomach, and in Biodromion come the Mysteries, and in Pionopsian the Apaturia, and in Poseidion the country Dionysia, and so on, for unless you refuse to listen, he never stops. 17. The bore. We may define a bore as a man who cannot refrain from talking. A bore is the sort of fellow who, the moment you open your mouth, tells you that your remarks are idle, that he knows all about it, and if you'll only listen, you'll soon find it out. As you attempt to make answer, he suddenly breaks in with such interruptions as, "Don't forget what you were about to say. That reminds me. What an admirable thing talk is. But, as I omitted to mention, you grasp the idea at once. I was watching this long time to see whether you would come to the same conclusion as myself." In phrases like this, he's so fertile that the person who happens to meet him cannot even open his mouth to speak. When he has vanquished a few stray victims here and there, his next move is to advance upon whole companies and put them to flight in the midst of their occupations. He goes upon the wrestling ground or into the schools, and prevents the boys from making progress with their lessons. So incessant is his talk with the teachers and the wrestling masters. If you say you are going home, he's pretty sure to come along and escort you to your house. Whenever he learns the day set for the session of the assembly, he noises it diligently abroad, and recalls Demosthenes' famous bout with Aeschines in the archonship of Aristophon. He mentions, too, his own humble effort on a certain occasion, and the approval which it won among the people. As he rattles on, he launches invectives against the masses, in such fashion that his audience either becomes oblivious or begins to doze, or else melts away in the midst of his harangue. When he's on a jury, he's an obstacle to reaching a verdict. When he's in the theater, he prevents attention to the play. At a feast, he hinders eating, remarking that silence is too much of an effort, that his tongue is hung in the middle, and that he couldn't keep still, even though he should seem a worse chatterer than a magpie. And when he's made a butt by his own children, he submits. When in their desire to go to sleep they say, "Papa, tell us something," in order that sleep may come. 18. The rough. Roughness is coarse conduct, whether in word or act. The rough takes an oath lightly, and is insensible to insult and ready to give it. In character, he is a sort of town bully, obscene in manner, ready for anything and everything. He is willing, sober, and without a mask, to dance the vulgar cordax in comic chorus. At a show, he goes around from man to man and collects the pennies, quarreling with the spectators who present a pass, and therefore insist on seeing the performance free. He is the sort of man to keep a hostelry or brothel or to farm the taxes. There is no business he considers beneath him, but he is ready to follow the trade of crier, cook, or gambler. He does not support his mother, is caught at theft, and spends more time in jail than in his home. He is the type of man who collects a crowd of bystanders and harangues them in a loud, brawling voice. While he is talking, some are going and others coming without listening to him. To one part of the moving crowd he tells the beginning of his story, to another part a sketch of it, and to another part a mere fragment. He regards a holiday as the fittest time for the full exhibition of his roughness. He is a great figure in the courts as plaintiff or defendant. Sometimes he excuses himself on oath from trial, but later he appears with a bundle of papers in the breast of his cloak and a file of documents in his hands. He enjoys the role of generalissimo in a band of rowdy loafers. He lends his followers money, and on every shilling collects a penny interest per day. He visits the bake shops and the markets for fresh and pickled fish, collects his tribute from them, and stuffs it in his cheek. 19. The affable man. Affability is a sort of demeanor that gives pleasure at the sacrifice of what is best. The affable man is the kind of person who hails a friend at a distance, and after he has told him what a fine fellow he is, and has lavished brimming admiration on him, seizes both his hands and is unwilling to let them go. He escorts the friend a step on his way, and as he asks, "When shall we meet again?" tears himself away with praises still falling from his lips. When summoned to court, he wishes to please not merely the man in whose interest he appears, but his adversary too, that he may seem to be nonpartisan. And of strangers he says that they pronounce juster judgment than his townsmen. If he's invited out to dinner, he asks his host to call in the children, and when they come, he declares they're as like their father as one fig is like another, and he draws them toward him, kisses them, and sets them by his side. Sometimes he joins in their sports, shouting strike and foul, and sometimes he lets them go to sleep in his lap in spite of the burden. 20. The impudent man. Impudence is easy to define. It is conduct that is obtrusively offensive. The impudent man is one who, on meeting respectable women in the street, insults them as he passes. At a play, he claps his hands after all the rest have stopped, and hisses the players when others wish to watch in silence. When the theater is still, he suddenly stands up and disgorges to make the audience look round. When the marketplace is crowded, he steps up to the stalls where nuts, myrtleberries, or fruits are for sale, and begins to pick at them as he talks to the merchant. He calls by name people whom he doesn't know and stops those intent upon some errand. When a man has just lost an important case and is now leaving the court, he runs up and tenders his congratulations. He buys his own provisions, too, and hires his own musicians, showing his purchases to every man he meets and inviting him to come and share the feast. Again, he takes his stand before a barber's booth or a perfumer's stall and proclaims unblushingly his intention of getting drunk. 21. The gross man. Grossness is such neglect of one's person as gives offense to others. The gross man is one who goes about with an eczema, or white eruption, or diseased nails, and says that these are congenital ailments, for his father had them and his grandfather too, and it would be hard to foist an outsider upon their family. He's very apt to have sores on his shins and bruises on his toes, and to neglect these things so that they grow worse. His armpits are hairy like an animal's for a long distance down his sides. His teeth are black and decayed. As he eats, he blows his nose with his fingers. As he talks, he drools, and has no sooner drunk wine than up it comes. After bathing, he uses rancid oil to anoint himself, and when he goes to the marketplace, he wears a thick tunic and a thin outer garment disfigured with spots of dirt. When his mother goes to consult the soothsayer, he utters words of evil omen, and when people pray and offer sacrifices to the gods, he lets the goblet fall, laughing as though he had done something amusing. When there's playing on the flute, he alone of the company claps his hands, singing an accompaniment and upbraiding the musician for stopping so soon. Often he tries to spit across the table, only to miss the mark and hit the butler. 22. The boor. Boorishness is ignorance of good form. The boor is the sort of man who takes a strong drink and then goes to the assembly. He insists that myrrh has not a whit sweeter smell than onions. His boots are too big for his feet, and he talks in a loud voice. He distrusts even friends and kinsmen, while his most important secrets are shared with his domestics, and he tells all the news of the assembly to his farm hands. Nothing awakens his admiration or startles him on the streets so much as the sight of an ox, an ass, or a goat, and then he stands agape in contemplation. He is the sort of man who snatches a bite from the pantry and drinks his liquor straight. He has clandestine talks with the cook and helps her grind the meal for his household. At breakfast, he throws bits to the animals about the table. He answers the knock at the door himself and then whistles for his dog, takes him by the nose and says, "Here's the keeper of my house and grounds." When a man offers him a coin, he declines it, saying it is too worn, and takes another piece in its stead. After loaning a plow, basket, sickle, or sack, he goes after it, unable to sleep for thinking of it. When he goes to town, he inquires of any chance passer-by, "What are hides selling for? What's the price of bacon? Does the celebration of new moon come today?" Then he remarks he must go down street and have his hair cut, and while in town must also run into the shop of Archias and buy the bacon. He sings in the public baths and wears hobnail boots. 23. The penurious man. Penuriousness is the grudging of expense, and is due to great love of money and little love of honor. The penurious man, after a victory on the tragic stage, sets up a wooden chaplet to Dionysus, on which he inscribes his own name. If contributions from the public are asked for, he is silent or rises and quits the company. When he gives his daughter in marriage, he sells the sacrificial offerings, accepting the parts that belong by law to the priests. At the wedding, he employs only servants who will eat at home. As trierarch, he takes the pilot's blankets and spreads them on deck for himself, while he puts his own away. He is the sort of man who keeps his children from school when a festival comes, and makes excuses for them on the plea of ill health, that he may avoid the fee for tuition. When he goes to market, he brings the meat home with him, carrying the vegetables in the folds of his cloak. He stays indoors when he sends his tunic to the cleaner. If he catches sight of a friend coming towards him and soliciting contributions, he sneaks off through a by-street and goes home by a roundabout way. He employs no maid for his wife, although she brought him a dowry, but hires a child from the woman's market to accompany her on her errands. He keeps his patched shoes until they are twice worn out, saying they are still good and tough as horn. When he gets up, he dusts the house and makes the beds, and when he sits down, he lays aside the coat he is wearing in order to spare it. 24. The pompous man. Pompousness is contempt for everybody save oneself. If you have urgent business, the pompous man will tell you that he will meet you after dinner on his walk. If he has done you a favor, he reminds you of it. When elected to office, he declines, saying under oath he has no leisure. He is not disposed to make the first call on anybody. Tradesmen and hired men he orders to come to him by daybreak. As he passes along the street, he does not greet the men he meets. He lowers his eyes and when it suits him, raises them again. If he entertains friends, he does not dine with them, but instructs some of his underlings to attend to the duties of entertainment. He sends a messenger ahead when he makes a call to say that he approaches. He allows no one to enter while he is at his oil rub, his bath, or his dinner. When he is casting an account, he instructs a slave to set down the items, foot up the total, and arrange it in a statement for him. He does not write in a letter, "You would do me a favor," but "I want this done, and I have sent for this and wish to have it, and see to it that my orders are followed precisely, and have this done immediately." 25. The braggart. Bragging is pretending to have excellences that one does not really possess. The braggart is the man who stands on the wharf and tells the bystanders how much capital he has invested in ships at sea, and tells how extensive is his business of loaning money, and how much he has made and lost by different ventures. As he talks thus magnificently, he sends his slave to the banker, where he has exactly 1 shilling to his credit. On a journey he imposes on his traveling companion by telling him that he once served with Alexander, and how intimate were their relations, and how many jeweled cups he brought back from his campaigns. As regards the Asiatic artists, he counts them better than those in Europe, and all this he tells you without having once set foot outside his native city. He claims further to have 3 letters from Antipater bidding him come to Macedonia, but he declares that, though he has been guaranteed the privilege of exporting wood free of duty, he has refused to go, simply to avoid being suspected by his fellow citizens of foreign leanings. The Macedonians, he says, in urging him so to come, ought to have considered this point. In time of famine, he says his expenditures for the poor amounted to over 5 talents, for he hadn't the heart to refuse. When he's with strangers, he often bids someone place the reckoning counters on the table, and computing by 600s and by minae, glibly mentioning the names of his pretended debtors, he makes a total of 24 talents, saying that the whole sum had gone for voluntary contributions, and that too without including subscriptions for the navy or for other public objects. At times he goes to the horse market where blooded stock is for sale, and makes pretense of wanting to buy, and stepping up to the block, he hunts his clothes for 2 talents, upbraiding his servant for coming along without any money. Though he lives in a rented house, he represents it to those who do not know as the family homestead, yet adds that he is thinking of selling it as being too small for the proper entertainment of his friends. 26. The Oligarch. Oligarchy is a love of power that clings tightly to personal advantage. The oligarch rises in the people's councils, when assistants to the archon are elected for the management of a fete, and says, these men must have absolute control, and although others have suggested 10, he insists that 1 is enough. The only line of Homer that stays in his memory is a crowd's rule is bad, let there be 1 ruler. He knows no other verse. He is, however, an adept at such phrases as this: we must hold a caucus and make our plans. We must cut loose from mob and market. We must throw aside the annoyance of petty office and of insult or honor at the masses' whim. We or they must rule the state. At midday he goes out with his mantle thrown about him, his hair dressed in the mode, and his nails fashionably trimmed. He promenades down Odeon Way, saying, sycophants have made the city no longer habitable. What outrages we endure in court from our persecutors. Why men nowadays go into office is a marvel to me. How ungrateful the mob is, although one is always giving and giving and giving. If at the assembly a naked, hungry vagabond sits next to him, he complains of the outrage. When, he asks, is a stop to be put to this ruin of our property by taxation for fetes and navies? How odious is this crew of demagogues! Theseus, he says, was the forefront of all this offending, for out of 12 cities he brought the masses into one to overthrow the monarchies. He met his just reward. He was the first to fall a victim at their hands. This is the way he talks to foreigners and to citizens of his own temper and party. 27. The Backbiter. Backbiting is a disposition to vilify others. When the backbiter is asked, "Who is so-and-so?" he begins, like the genealogists, with the man's ancestry. His father's name was originally Sosius, but amongst the soldiers it became Sosistratus, and upon registration in the deme it was again changed to Sosidamus. His mother was a Thracian, gentle blood, you see. At any rate, this jewel's name was Crinocorica. Women of that name are of gentle blood in Thrace, so people say. The man himself, with an ancestry like that, is a foul fellow fit for the whipping post. In a company where his companions are maligning a man, he of course takes up the attack, and says, "For my part, I hate him of all men." He is a bad character, as one may see from his face, and as for his meanness, it has no parallel, and here is a proof. His wife brought him a dowry of talents of money, and yet after the birth of their first child, he gave her but 3 pence a day for household expenses, and forced her to bathe in cold water on the festival of Poseidon in midwinter. When he is seated with a group, he loves to talk about an acquaintance who has just risen and gone, and his biting tongue does not spare even the man's kinsfolk. Of his own relatives and friends, he says the vilest things, and even maligns the dead. Backbiting is what he calls frankness of speech, democracy, and freedom, and there is nothing he enjoys so much. 28. The Avaricious Man. Avarice is greedy love of gain. When the avaricious man gives a dinner, he puts scant allowance of bread on the table. He borrows money of a stranger who is lodging with him. When he distributes the portions at table, he says it is fair for the laborer to receive double, and straightway loads his own plate. He engages in wine traffic, and sells adulterated liquors even to his friend. He goes to the show and takes his children with him on the days when spectators are admitted to the galleries free. When he is the people's delegate, he leaves at home the money provided by the city and borrows from his fellow commissioners. He loads more luggage on his porter than the man can carry, and provides him with the smallest rations of any man in the party. When presents are given the delegates by foreign courts, he demands his share at once and sells it. At the bath he says the oil brought him is bad, and shouts, "Boy, the oil is rancid," and in its stead takes what belongs to another. If his servants find money on the highway, he demands a share of it, saying, "Luck's gifts are common property." When he sends his cloak to be cleaned, he borrows another from an acquaintance and keeps it until it is asked for. He also does this sort of thing. He uses King Frugal's measure with the bottom dented in for doling out supplies to his household, and then secretly brushes off the top. He sells underweight even to his friend, who thinks he is buying according to market standard. When he pays a debt of £30, he does so with a discount of 4 shillings. When owing to sickness his children are not at school the entire month, he deducts a proportionate amount from the teacher's pay. And during the month of Anthesterion, he does not send them to their studies at all on account of the frequent shows, and so he avoids tuition fees. If he receives copper from a slave who has been serving out, he demands in addition the exchange value of silver. When he gets a statement from the deme's administrator, he demands provision for his slaves at public cost. He makes note of the half-radishes left on the table to keep the servants from taking them. If he goes abroad with friends, he uses their servants and hires his own out, yet he does not contribute to the common fund the money thus received. When others combine with him to give a banquet at his house, he secretly includes in his account the wood, figs, vinegar, salt, and lamp oil, trifles furnished from his supplies. If a marriage is announced in a friend's family, he goes away a little beforehand to avoid sending a wedding present. He borrows of friends such articles as they would not ask to have returned, or such as, if returned, they would not readily accept. 29. The Late Learner. The late learner has a fondness for study late in life. He commits whole passages of poetry to memory when 60 years of age, but when he essays to quote them at a banquet, his memory trips. From his son he learns forward march, shoulder arms, about face. At the feast of heroes he pits himself against the boys in the torch race. And of course when he is invited to the temple of Hercules, he throws aside his mantle and makes ready to lift the steer, that he may bend back its neck. At the shows he stays one performance after another until he has learned the songs by heart. If he is dedicated to Sabazius, he is eager to be declared the fairest. If he falls in love with some damsel, he makes an onset on her door, only to be assaulted by a rival and hauled before the court. He makes a trip to the country on a mare he has never before ridden, and essaying feats of horsemanship on the road, he falls and breaks his head. He joins a boys' club, too, and entertains the members at his house. He plays ducks and drakes with his servant, and competes at archery and javelin throwing with his children's tutor, and he expects the tutor, as though ignorant of these sports, to learn them from him. He wrestles at the baths, turning a bench nimbly about to create the impression that he has been well trained in the art, and if women happen to be standing near, he trips a dance, whistling his own music. 30. The Vicious Man. Viciousness is love of what is bad. The vicious man is one who associates with men convicted in public suits, and who assumes that, if he makes friends of these fellows, he will gain in knowledge of the world, and so will be more feared. Of upright men he declares that no one is by nature upright, but that all men are alike, and he even reproaches the man who is honorable. The bad man, he asserts, is free from prejudice, if one will but make the trial, And while in some respects he admits that men speak truly of such a man, in others he refuses to allow it. For says he, the fellow is clever, companionable, and a gentleman. In fact, he maintains that he never met so talented a person. He supports him, therefore, when he speaks in the assembly or is defendant in court, and to those sitting in judgment, he's apt to say that one must judge not the man, but the facts. And he declares that his friend is the very watchdog for the people, for he watches out for evildoers. And he adds, we shall no longer have men to burden themselves with a care for the common weal if we abandon men like him. It's the vicious man's way to constitute himself the patron of all worthless scamps, and to support them before the court in desperate cases, and when he passes judgment, he puts the worst construction on the arguments of the opposing counsel. And with that 30th sketch, we've reached the end of the characters of Theophrastus. I don't know about you, but I definitely recognize some of those people. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. I always love hearing from you. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.